It's 2005 and 40,000 Cameroonians are almost too nervous to watch. They have a penalty in literally the last minute of the game.
But they're not the only ones anxiously watching.
Over in Sudan, the Côte d'Ivoire team are gathered around the TV in the change room, well aware of the stakes. If Cameroon score, Cameroon goes to the 2006 World Cup. If they miss, then the Ivory Coast makes their first ever World Cup.
But no one misses penalties, right? As a deathly silence falls across the stadium,
Pandemonium breaks out in the Ivory Coast change room as their talismanic leader, Didier Drogba, asks for journalists to enter.
Gathering his teammates, he addressed the nation.
Ivoiriens, du nord et du sud, du central-ouest. Vous avez vu, on vous a prouvé aujourd'hui que toute la Côte d'Ivoire peut cohabiter.
But was this just another athlete virtue signaling in some vague way?
Je vous demande, s'il vous plaît, on se met à genoux. Pardonnez.
Not only were there days of public celebration, but the unbelievable then happened.
There was a ceasefire, and the North and South agreed to hold talks. Weirdly, I remember reading about the Ivorian Civil War when I was about 8 years old. Drogba stops a civil war.
Now, the temptation when talking about an African war is to just reduce it to warlords fighting.
TIA, right, Med?
TIA.
What's TIA?
This is Africa.
But there was a whole lot more that went down in Côte d'Ivoire.
Now, you might have noticed that I've used Ivory Coast and Côte d'Ivoire interchangeably. That's because Britain were actually the first ones to take a sniff at West Africa. If you look at this map, the British colonised here for its rich gold reserves. Aptly, Britain called it the Gold Coast.
Which, for my fellow Australians, is not conjuring up a great image.
Hey guys, we're out here today at Schoolies 2019. I'm your Gold Coast Young LNP chair.
But Africa's Gold Coast would go on to adopt a far more familiar name, Ghana. What this meant was that Britain was happy for the French to claim this territory over here as theirs, and they officially recognised French sovereignty in 1899. Unable to draw upon the same levels of gold as next door, Côte d'Ivoire specialised on a more basic economy: cocoa, coffee, and bananas.
And in the era of post-war decolonisation, Côte d'Ivoire gained their independence from the French in 1960.
It's a marvelous day in Yamoussoukro as the Ivorian people celebrate their independence from the French.
So the Ivory Coast was led by a guy called Félix Houphouët-Boigny. His background was quite interesting.
So he'd served as a member of French Parliament, and his party was called the PDCI.
I won't say it in French. Okay, Parti Démocratique de la Côte d'Ivoire. Anyway, what you need to know is that they had their background as a farmers' union party.
And Houphouët-Boigny's Ivory Coast was run on two principles. One, sell coffee, and two, keep good relations with the French.
Tour d'horizon, qui a embrassé, bien sûr, les rapports franco-ivoiriens en tout premier lieu.
In terms of foreign policy, foreign companies were allowed to repatriate 90% of their profits to their home country. So this was great news for companies like Nestle.
But to say Houphouët-Boigny just let foreign companies plunder the Ivory Coast is a little simplistic.
His government instituted quite high prices to buy produce from Ivorian farmers.
Of course, this was to incentivize grain production, but it worked.
During the 1960s, the Ivory Coast was responsible for about 40% of West Africa's exports. From 1960 to 1978, their GDP grew by 1,200% and their coffee production was only behind Brazil and Colombia. This made them the 6th richest nation in all of Africa, and relatively speaking, life was good. Sure, Houphouët-Boigny's PDCI was the only party you were allowed to be a part of, but from the West point of view, it was okay because he was a loyal soldier. Côte d'Ivoire had broken relations with both the Soviets and China, and Western coffee companies were really profiting.
But then came the coffee crash.
The coffee boom of Africa is over. It was naive to operate as though Colombia and Brazil wouldn't return.
What I've got right here isn't a graph of the stock market or GDP or anything like that. It's the historical price of coffee. As you can see, prices peaked all the way back in 1977. That was because South America had a particularly poor harvest, which was great news for Côte d'Ivoire. But have a look at the drop off from 1977 to 1978. As South America recovered, prices dropped to nearly a third of their 1977 value.
While the rest of the world, even China, got rich in the 1980s, the Ivorian economy badly stagnated.
By the end of the decade, they dropped to 14th on the list of wealthiest economies in Africa, and finally there was opposition to Houphouët-Boigny.
Après 6 ans d'exil en France, hébergé par les socialistes, il est de retour au pays en 1988.
So this guy right here is a guy called Laurent Gbagbo. He was a trade unionist and a history teacher, and he formed the opposition called the Ivorian Popular Front.
Now, Gbagbo was someone who took full advantage of the divisions that were starting to grow within the Ivory Coast.
So Ivorian religion was split pretty evenly. Down here in the south was primarily Christian, however up here in the north was primarily Muslim. Not only that, but many living in the north were descendants of migrants who'd moved from Burkina Faso during the coffee boom.
Côte d'Ivoire had 2 religions and 2 sets of ethnicities.
So, at the end of the 80s, Gbagbo was starting to voice his concerns about Burkinabes running the Ivory Coast and blamed the economic crash on Burkinabe migration.
And just as Gbagbo was starting to gain a following, Houphouët-Boigny died.
Long-term Ivorian president Félix Houphouët-Boigny has been taken off life support after being flown back from France to die in his home country.
So in 1993, Félix Houphouët-Boigny died, leaving a wealth of around 7 billion to 11 billion US dollars. Just for context, that's around about their 1993 GDP. But that's besides the point.
Essentially, upon Houphouët-Boigny's death, there were 3 contenders for leadership. The first was Gbagbo, but he was in opposition, so he was never going to be chosen. The next was a guy called Alassane Ouattara, but he was rejected by Houphouët-Boigny.
He also had Muslim Burkinabe heritage on his father's side.
And so that left our last guy for leadership, Henri Konan Bedie. He became the new president and was to serve until Houphouët-Boigny's term would have ended in 1995.
After that, there were to be elections.
As Henri Konan Bedie prepares for the upcoming 1995 election, he cannot shirk the accusation that this is simply an unfair and sussy contest.
So, right before the elections, Bedie passed a law which required all candidates to be Ivorian by birth and to have both parents to have lived in the Ivory Coast for 5 years before their birth. This of course disqualified Ouattara, and his supporters boycotted the election. The election was also boycotted by Gbagbo, causing mass protests across the nation. Bedie ordered his general, Robert Gay, to suppress the protest.
Remember that detail. Of course, with no real opposition, Bedie comfortably won the 1995 election, but not without a cost.
The whole process had alienated the military, and without the popularity of Houphouët-Boigny, the army launched a coup in 1999. Ironically, it was the exiled General Gay who took to the cameras declaring that Côte d'Ivoire would return to a democracy with immediate elections.
But here's the crazy thing, right? You remember how Bedie introduced those anti-Burkina Faso laws in 1995? You know, the ones that disqualified Ouattara from even running for office? Well, he brought them back.
General Gay actually went even further though. Whereas Bedie had just passed it as a law, Gay actually embedded it in the constitution before putting himself forward as a candidate.
Obviously, under those laws, Ouattara still couldn't run for president, but one of the 1995 boycotters could. Laurent Gbagbo.
It's quite remarkable. Laurent Gbagbo has taken the Ivory Coast by storm and is the hot favorite to be the next president of Côte d'Ivoire.
Gbagbo won convincingly, picking up 59% of the vote.
Now, remember, Ouattara was still around and was still pretty popular in the north. If Gbagbo was to have a true mandate, he really needed him neutralized.
But Gbagbo decided he'd go even further than both Bedie and Gay, introducing new voter ID laws to prove that they were truly Ivorian and not a child of someone from Burkina Faso.
Of course, this went down terribly in the north and really started to poison them against Gbagbo.
The crowds rejoice as the young patriots seize the northern cities.
So, in September of 2002, 800 soldiers mutinied and attacked several of Côte d'Ivoire's major cities. Now, while they failed to take the main city of Abidjan, they successfully took 2 major northern cities, Kohogo and Bouaké. With these cities now being declared war zones, there was a clear north-south divide.
For Gbagbo, this only justified the sentiment that foreigners were the problem, and he ordered the demolition of foreigners' homes, which ad hoc militias were all too happy to do.
Gay was shot on the day of the election, likely by Gbagbo's forces. Ouattara's house was burnt down, and he took refuge at the French ambassador's residence.
Now, remember, the French had significant business interests in the Ivory Coast, but given Gbagbo was so anti-foreigner, they were reluctant to support him, and they instead sent a third wave of peacekeeping soldiers.
Les renforcements que nous allons recevoir à compter de demain auront pour mission d'assurer la sécurité et la protection des ressortissants français et étrangers dans la région d'Abidjan.
But it wasn't just the French who joined.
Ghanaian UN Secretary General Kofi Annan ordered UN peacekeepers on the ground. In fact, Côte d'Ivoire became so French that during the war, they split into two regimes, dividing the north and the south.
And moments of unity were rare for the nation. Think of them as being like North and South Korea, except with a religious divide.
Que cette fête allait rassembler le peuple. Aujourd'hui, on vous demande, s'il vous plaît, on se met à genoux.
By this point, over 1,000 civilians had been killed and 750,000 were displaced from their homes. Ironically, it was in Burkina Faso of all places where the peace was signed. The 2007 Ouagadougou peace agreement saw the two forces agree to not only share power, but most crucially, reverse the Burkina rule that prohibited Ouattara from running for president.
In other words, Ouattara would now finally get to take on Gbagbo in an election. Initially, it was only supposed to be 10 months after the 2007 agreement, but it ended up being held in 2010. And it just went swimmingly.
But as the incumbent President Laurent Gbagbo clings to power, is the country sliding into civil war? Or would an outside intervention bring the conflict to an end?
So before we understand the showdown between Gbagbo and Ouattara, there's two crucial institutions we need to understand.
The first is the Independent Electoral Commission, which is self-explanatory. They count the votes. However, the second is the Constitutional Council. This was a body set up by Beatty in 1994 to ensure the anti-Burkina candidacy rules were being followed. Now they'd become firmly in the pocket of Gbagbo.
But as Côte d'Ivoire went to the election, each institution declared different results.
The Independent Commission declared it a resounding win for Ouattara of 54% to 46%. However, the Constitutional Council not only argued that it was much closer, but that Gbagbo in fact won 51.5% to 48.5%.
So which one was right? Well, everyone who fought in the Ivorian Civil War returned to their old allegiances, and what really mattered was who the international community recognised as the leader.
So the United Nations and the French officially recognised Ouattara as the legitimate leader of Côte d'Ivoire.
Of course, to Gbagbo loyalists, this just looked like more French colonialism and hardly persuaded them.
But it wasn't just those two. The African Union, the USA and the EU all agreed and called for Gbagbo to step down. He refused. Sporadic violence started to break out. In March, 30 civilians in a pro-Ouattara suburb in Abidjan were killed with rockets.
Rockets.
At the end of March, Ouattara announced that all peaceful methods of getting Gbagbo to step down had been exhausted, and that a full-scale invasion had to begin. Ouattara then took this city right here, San Pedro, the world's biggest cocoa exporter. The capital, Yamoussoukro, was also taken without resistance.
Gbagbo ordered the peacekeepers to leave, but of course this was to little avail.
Gbagbo had stationed himself here in Abidjan, but under pressure, the city was falling to Ouattara.
So what happened next was so wild. So the French fired rockets into Gbagbo's palace, which I know is a weird mix of historical eras here, but then Gbagbo tried to escape through secret tunnels, and he got caught.
À vouloir trop gagner, on finit par tout perdre. C'est ce qui vient d'arriver donc à Laurent Gbagbo.
Now, if you want an even broader picture, we actually have a full podcast on both Ivorian civil wars.
So conspiracy is that Ouattara's orchestrated both of those. There's no evidence for it. It's more of a crime of convenience rather than any hard proof for it.
Also, join the Mr. M community for free. Exciting things are coming soon, and you can be the first to know. But upon Gbagbo's arrest, he ordered his soldiers to lay down their weapons. Yet between this and the 2010 election, an estimated 3,248 Ivorians were killed.
Perhaps the worst was the massacre of 800 Ivorians in the city of Jikoui.
So while Ouattara continued to govern the Ivory Coast, Gbagbo requested protection from UN peacekeepers.
I know, ironic.
Ouattara had Gbagbo detained in Abidjan while the International Criminal Court investigated his actions. At the end of 2011, the ICC then made the controversial call to prosecute the first ever former head of state for murder, rape and other forms of violence.
Gbagbo was then transferred to The Hague, where he'd faced trial in 2016. His supporters claimed that this was just simply victor's justice.
This is not the first time that Ivorians have organised this kind of gathering, since President Gbagbo was kidnapped in Ivory Coast and deported here to the west in The Hague. It takes us back 400 years, to the years of slavery, the years of colonisation. That's what it reminds us of.
When his trial ended in 2019, his supporters anxiously gathered around the TV to hear the verdict.
Supporters of former Ivorian President Laurent Gbagbo react with joy at the International Criminal Court on Wednesday, upholding his acquittal on appeal on charges of crimes against humanity.
Gbagbo's acquittal left two implications. One, he clearly had his supporters still, and two, he was free to return home.
So Ouattara was governing the Ivory Coast throughout the whole decade, but his second term was due to expire in 2020. In 2017, he announced that he had no intention of recontesting and that his party, the RHDP, would put forward Amadou Gon Coulibaly as their candidate.
However, just 3 months before the election, this news story broke.
Moments before his death, Prime Minister Amadou Gon Coulibaly appeared upbeat as he entered a cabinet meeting. But inside the meeting, he suffered a coughing fit, collapsed, and died.
So that put Ouattara in a bit of a pickle, but it was okay because he still had another option. Defense Minister Ahmed Bakayoko, who was then accused of drug trafficking.
Bereft of options, Ouattara ran again. However, Gbagbo was still barred, as was another key opposition leader, Guillaume Soro. Because of this, the opposition decided to boycott the 2020 elections, giving Ouattara a 95% win margin.
So that was that. The Ivory Coast would remain under the control of Ouattara. Except in 2021, Gbagbo returned.
In 2019, his supporters, like Christelle Achan, have been eagerly awaiting his return.
It's all we wanted, one day of glory. We erase our 10 years of suffering. We won everything. Nothing to say, simply thanks to God because he gave us back our father.
Upon his return, Gbagbo formed a new party, the African People's Party, mainly because it meant he didn't have to go through politics of trying to retake leadership of the FPCI.
But surely Ouattara didn't stand for this. I mean, the two fought in a civil war. Was all just forgotten?
Well, the political reality was that Ouattara had already alienated opposition groups in 2020. If he pushed the South any further, we could see a third civil war. So he just allowed him to get back into politics and even gave him state security.
More than 10 years after their rivalry spilled into a bloody civil war, Ivory Coast's most prominent political enemies on Tuesday shared a hug.
So where does all of this leave the Ivory Coast today? Well, quite spectacularly, at the beginning of the year, they hosted the African Cup of Nations, and it started off as a disaster for them, losing 4-0 to Equatorial Guinea and 1-0 to Nigeria.
It really looked like they weren't even going to make it out of their own group, and so they fired their coach mid-tournament. However, a win against Guinea-Bissau actually got them out of their group before they went all the way to the final. In the final, their striker, Sebastien Haller, who was recovering from testicular cancer, scored the winner against Nigeria to send the nation into delirium.
Côte d'Ivoire was once again a united nation, winning at home. And that gives some hope for the upcoming 2025 election. Gbagbo's announced he's running for office.
This year, we also saw wild election results in Pakistan as supporters of the imprisoned Imran Khan surged ahead. However, the announcing of the results was then abruptly halted, only for us to learn afterwards that they'd now lost seats. Click here to get up to speed with Pakistan in less than 20 minutes.